Great. Good morning and welcome, everybody. I see we have some folks still streaming in. We're getting there. We have over 240 individuals registered for this event, which is really exciting, given that this is the fifth ever WIN conversation and convening that we've had. And as many of you know, WIN is a combination of efforts between the Women's Foundation of Boston and the Red Sox Foundation. I will be your host this morning. My name is Bekah Salwasser. I'm the Executive Director of the Red Sox Foundation. And as I mentioned, we are in partnership with the Women's Foundation of Boston, who is led by the wonderful and extraordinary Christina Gordon, who's their executive director. So thank you for joining us this morning. I want to get right in because we have a very exciting conversation around leveraging your board, which, as all of us know in nonprofit, is critical to your success. I will be taking notes personally as I have a board meeting tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. So this is a timely conversation. I do want to just extend our gratitude for your flexibility. I know we rescheduled this conversation from the 20th to today. So thank you all for staying with us and again, being here this morning. Very quickly, I did want to call out a new exciting opportunity that the Women's Foundation of Boston has just rolled out. It's their Young Women's Leadership Program, which is a year-long leadership program for young women in the nonprofit sector. We're actually going to put the link in the chat box right now for more information. So please forward it to younger members of your organization or in your network who might benefit from this type of leadership opportunity. A little bit of housekeeping before we get into the conversation. It's a 1-hour session. We'll be done, I promise, by 11 o'clock promptly. Like I said, we have about 240 people joining us today. Very exciting. This event will be recorded and we'll make it available after the event on the WIN YouTube channel. And so we'll email out the link as well so you can access it that way. The camera will be on our 4 panelists today. I'll introduce them in a moment, but you will be able to ask questions throughout this conversation. As you know, our favorite part of these WIN conversations is integrating and connecting with you out there. So please, this entire conversation, check in with questions, check in to panelists directly, check in with me. We want this to be as engaging and conversational as possible. We will hope to get to all the questions. I can't promise that we will. I'm looking at them now. We already have close to 50 that we're going to try to get through this morning, but we'll do our best, I promise. We'll close out this conversation with a fun raffle with our partner Dream Spa Medical in Brookline. We're going to be raffling off some facials, which Josh, I know one of our panel, you can use them too. Facials aren't just for women, good for everyone.
And I'm an equal opportunity guy.
Exactly. And the raffle will be available for those that registered by January 11th. Last bit of housekeeping before we get into the conversation. When you exit the Zoom, you will be prompted to take a quick survey. Please, if you have 1 moment, 1 minute, please fill it out. Those survey questions inform what we will do for the next WIN conversation. All of these are shaped and formed by your interests. So we want this to be participant driven. So it's very important that you're just taking the 30 seconds to fill out that information so we can gather and convene in a way that's most impactful for you and your organization. So let's jump into the conversation. Today is about leveraging your board, how to effectively engage, motivate, and fundraise with your board of directors. We have an incredibly experienced, talented, cross-sectional group of panelists today. I'm so grateful for them taking the time out to be here this morning. I will quickly introduce them, but I'm going to have them do their own bio because they know themselves best. Firstly, we have Yolanda. I asked her earlier, and I'm not going to mess this up. Coentro. There we go. President and CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. We have Josh Kraft, who, as many of you know, recently transitioned from, I think, 30 years plus, Josh, as CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston to now become the president of the Kraft Family Philanthropies. And last but certainly not least, we have the famous CEO of Lindauer Global, who I've worked with before, and that organization is amazing, Deb Taft. So if I could quickly have Yolanda and then Deb after Yolanda and then followed by Josh. 1 minute of who you are, what you do, where your passions lie, and again, thank you for joining us. Yolanda.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I am the president and CEO of the Institute for Nonprofit Practice. We are a scaling Boston-born national organization that is working to advance the social sector by investing in talent across the spectrum, and especially leaders who are majority, BIPOC, and women. So this is just honor to be here and a topic that's near and dear to my heart. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. So thanks for the invitation.
Great to be here also. Deb Taft, CEO of Lindauer. Some of you may know us as a nonprofit search firm, national, global, particular expertise in fundraising for years, but at this point do a whole range of nonprofit roles. And a longtime nonprofit leader in the Boston area, Concord Academy, Dana-Farber and the Jimmy Fund, Tufts Medical, Floating Hospital, Simmons, Girl Scouts in New York, and then moving into consulting and search, but really privileged right now to serve on two boards. Couple boards, but two that I'll mention: Girl Scouts of Eastern Mass and Human Rights Campaign National Board. So a regional, local, and a national.
Josh Kraft, as Bekah mentioned, just transitioned after 30 years with Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston to Kraft family, president of Kraft Family Philanthropies, and you could say whether it was at Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston or here, I've had the privilege to work with so many great like-minded people, and really to go 50,000 feet in the air. And all of us, no matter who I was, program partners, donors, and of course board members. And you know, I have some tough board members here, my dad and brothers. The goal we always wanted to do was reach people that are marginalized and need opportunity. So our big 50,000 foot goal, wherever I've had the privilege and who I've had the privilege to work with, is to create access to opportunities for those that are forgotten, marginalized, etc. So, and thank you for allowing me to be here.
Of course, we are equal opportunity, as you said, Josh. Of course.
Exactly, and I hope I get one of those facials.
Well, let's stay with you, Josh. And I think this is an appropriate first question, which is before we get into how to leverage your board, how to build a board. How do you prospect for board members? How do you know if an individual is the right fit for your organization? I know you had quite a board at the Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston. How do you prospect for members?
Thanks, Bekah. So yeah, we're so fortunate at Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston to have the board of directors and trustees, and actually the local number of the clubs had local advisory boards. So, you know, I would say number one, we are so fortunate to have a number of evangelists and ambassadors for our mission, for the kids and families we serve. So what we would do first is lean on a lot of them that we knew a long time, you know, that were committed to us, and say, hey, do you have any friends, people you know that would love to see what we do? And of course, that was one of the ways, rely on our board members that we had great confidence in, that we know were genuine ambassadors for us. That was one way they would bring people. The other way is, of course, in today's world of the internet, you research people, you research prospects, and if you find them, you know, you find ways to engage them. You ask your board, does anyone know Joe Smith? You know, we heard he's new to the city, loves Boys and Girls Clubs, or loves whatever it is you're doing. That's another way. A third way is to bring your mission, to get folks to see your mission firsthand, whether you bring them in, no matter what your organization is. If you're serving clients on location, in buildings, get potential board prospects to see what you do or what the staff you work with does every day, or bring it out. You know, I know all of us know we have, again, great ambassadors who might host a house party or some type of event where we could bring the mission to them. But bringing new potential board members in contact with your mission live is the best way to engage them and hopefully inspire them. And the last thing I'll say is, when you do, whoever your board member is, or whoever he or she or they are, you know, we always used to say at Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston, to keep them engaged and to build that engagement, we always like to treat board members, donors, or whoever like the kids that come into our building get treated. Make them feel like they belong, make them feel like they matter, no matter what size gift or no matter what they do. And you want them to walk out of a meeting or an exchange feeling, wow, I feel great about being involved.
Yep. Yep. All excellent points. And to continue this theme of building a board, Yolanda, I'd love to hear from you. Again, a little bit about the technical side of building the board. What is the right size and how do you build the diversity of a board? And diversity is not just race and ethnicity. It can be gender, it can be industry, it can be giving capacity. All those things matter. So would love your thoughts about continued building of boards.
Great, thank you. So first, I should mention when I started out as CEO, I happened to schedule a meeting with Josh Kraft to discuss this matter and get his advice. Josh, I think that might have been our first meeting actually ever.
I remember
and then I was like, hey, you think you could come teach everybody at INP all about this? And he was kind enough to come. But that being said, you know, what I've learned along the way is and you know, Deb and Josh, please chime in here. The size of a board is really dependent on the needs of your organization, the capacity that staff have to manage the board in the organization. I can think of really large nonprofits like the Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston or Facing History and ourselves, or large nonprofits that have many committees, various board levels, you know, and they have staff who can manage all of these volunteers. And I think that's just, it's critically important to know where you are and what you have the capacity for, so that the folks that you do bring on, you can meaningfully engage. And I think sometimes we kind of build beyond our capacity, and then that shapes a culture both on the board level, but then it also like kind of trickles down to the staff level that can be, you know, I think harmful at the end of the day to the mission. So you know, for us, at this phase, so we are about a $4 million nonprofit. We're scaling fast. As we think about our scale generally anyway, and knowing our internal capacity for board engagement, you know, we kind of look at it as we want to have a fiduciary board somewhere between 15 and 20 people at any given time, and then committees of the board where we can engage other folks who are not fiduciary board members, and those can retract or expand based on the work, right? So some committees, we don't get a ton of people who want to join our finance and audit committee. I don't know why, but it's just not the most attractive one. But so that's a smaller committee than our strategy committee, where we have a lot of people excited about our growth and our impact, and they want to participate. So I think you have to decide that with your team and your board, and not get too far ahead. You know, when I talked to Josh and he had this like incredible infrastructure for board and volunteer management, you know, for boards and volunteers, and then a management structure, you know, I hope like we aspire to that as we're larger, but we're not there yet. So know where you are. Relative to diversity across the spectrum, as you said, I think it's really important to, you know, hold that you have to be explicit. What diversity are you talking about? Like, it's okay to say race and gender and field and, you know, whatever it might be, age, expertise. And so there, you know, for us, we advise folks to use data and tracking mechanisms to capture conversations you're having at the board level. And I think also on the executive team level, it's important to align around how does our board, our top level of leadership, align with our mission and embody our mission and forward our mission. And so, you know, the types of diversity you might be looking for will vary. You know, if it's a women's organization, if it's an organization serving primarily young people, if it's an organization serving primarily people of color or a specific racial or ethnic group or a religious group, So I think sometimes we get into dangerous territory when we just cast a wide net and we just say, oh, well, every board needs to be more diverse. And then we don't all know what we're talking about. So have that intentional conversation with your board, be explicit about the goals, set goals that are data informed. We set goals like we want to increase our racial diversity across these races or these sets of expertise or whatever by 40% by the end of the year. So we set realistic goals and aspirational ones. Where do we want to be if we were to achieve exactly what this board should look like to forward and embody our mission? What does that look like? We might not get to it this year, but if you don't set a this year goal relative to the aspirational goal, there's no accountability, and you need to engage your whole team in that.
Yeah, that's so many good points there, Yolanda. And Deb, I'd love to come to you a little bit with also kind of the technical side of board management to close out this conversation of building the right board. And Yolanda touched upon this a little bit with committees, but in your experience, which is very deep with boards, how do you hold the best board meeting? What is the right frequency of an organization? Again, Yolanda touched on this with the capacity of the org, but in your professional opinion, number of board meetings, how do you engage in this world of remote and Zoom? What are the best number of committees relative to the size of your board? Just a little more of that technical side of it, please.
Yeah, and let me put a little framing around it, because I think there's 4 things that I think a lot about, which is getting this balance of governance and executive function right. And I'm just going to say that up front because I think a lot of boards don't get it right. And the old framing is noses in, fingers out, right? So you want to be sort of sensing what's going on and asking the right questions. That's our role, is asking questions, but not trying to, our day jobs are where we do the executive function. And this is governance, and it is different and important for everybody to learn that and get it right. Time for engagement and generative discussion in boards. So a lot of boards have a lot of reporting at. You're going to a board meeting and sitting and being talked at for hours. It doesn't work. There needs to be engagement of board members, and I'll say another word about that in a minute, but peer reporting at board meetings. So very, very important that it not just be an expert staff talking at a board, but that board members are speaking to one another for a couple of reasons. One is that engagement is exactly what engages a board member to do more, give more, be more active, be better representative and ambassador. And also, it's the very nature of a board that it needs to be independent from the organization. That's a public charity issue. The other thing that I would do is put executive sessions in at the end of every time. So when we think, I think Yolanda's right about the board size. It depends so much on where the organization is in its maturity, and what it needs and what it can support. I think that staffing issue was super important. Local boards are often meeting once a month for, let's say, 2 hours with a full board, and then executive session with no staff in the room. And this is when I said, put executive sessions in at the every time and at the end of committee meetings to make sure board members are talking to one another. And it's not meant to create an oppositional situation with staff, but making sure that we are speaking openly, because ultimately the governance of the organization comes back to us. A national board might meet a few times a year, and we have to think about what that structure looks like. It's very often, flying in for 2 days or a day and a half. People are very busy. The busier you get, the more obviously this needs to be scheduled. Schedule the full meetings for the full year ahead on committees and on individuals. And on the full board. And then Zooms, I would just say on this whole virtual life, breakouts, social time, set maybe separate social time if you can't build it into board meetings. It actually has worked pretty well in a couple of boards I've been on, and it takes much more personal outreach in between. I'll bet you Josh and I and our boards are doing much more individual calls with people to get in between.
Definitely.
Excellent points, Deb. And I love that phrase. I'd never heard it, noses in, fingers out. That's fantastic. So I'd like to transition a little bit now to fundraising directly from your board. And Josh, I'm gonna lead with you, but we got the majority of our questions from the registrants came around this question of how to fundraise through your board. And I think so much goes into this. So I'd love to get your expertise around what's the appropriate, give get for a board member? How do you even approach the conversation of fundraising with your board? How do you know the capacity that someone might be able to get? So much goes into this. So I'd love to just toss it to you for your thoughts.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Bekah. So, and I can't go the give get. Maybe I'll get to in a sec, and I don't want to ramble on too much, but I'll open the answer to how I closed the last one, and that's around making your board members and even your donors, for that matter, feel like they matter. So, in this day and age, I think a lot of folks are told in nonprofit leadership roles, oh, you don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to ask. But the big miss in all that is, yeah, don't be afraid to ask, but don't just ask after you haven't built a true stewardship relationship, because it happens all the time. And it really turns people off big time. So I'll go back to, I think the key to raising money, whether it's from board members or donors or people in the community, is stewardship. Really, it's not about being, oh, just ask, shoot for the stars. They can put no. You gotta make somebody feel good about the work you're doing, the people you're serving, and you gotta steward them. And that can take all ways, shapes, and forms. I know Deb just mentioned it, in terms of whether it's phone calls to check in, personal notes, especially in today's day and note, whether you write a whole handwritten card or on the bottom of your tax letters that you sign, you really should say, I hope your son's basketball season is going well at school. Just show that you're genuinely interested in the person. As I said, for us at Boys and Girls Clubs, it was easy to just compare it to the kids that walk in our building. Make them feel like they matter. Make them feel like they belong and they're a part of the community you're creating. And I would say the same about board members. Really show that you're interested in their input. I know we've talked, Yolanda was talking about the committee meetings, and engage folks in their committee, their expertise. Let them know, that their opinion and their thoughts matter, and that you want to incorporate them because they genuinely care about the mission. So when you do that, the give and get, it's obviously, and I probably am not telling folks things they don't know, it's researching where they've given before, researching areas that are interesting to them. Again, at Boys and Girls Clubs, it was easier for us because we can say, oh, these folks love music, so we can direct them to our music clubhouses. These folks love civic engagement, so what about our Keystone and youth leadership program? So we could do it around there. And then, of course, it's, as I said, it's the research. What have they given at, this place or that place that's similar to ours, So researching that. But I can't emphasize enough, though. And then you'll figure out the right ask and the right gift amount. And it's obviously, we always, another thing we like to say is, you can, I'll give a story. We were in a huge campaign where we raised 132 million over 5 years. And there was a person who got involved with us late in the campaign that it was not only a generous, thoughtful person, but had capacity. So the whole push was, should we ask them? Should we ask them? Like, they're still getting used to everything. Let's keep them engaged. We did something with one of our annual dinners with them. And then post-campaign, a year after the campaign, this person and their family made a record-breaking gift to us, which actually, I know it's been a few years, will probably be more public in the next year. But so I think that was, we engaged, we stewarded, we worked, and we wanted the person to feel good about us before we asked. And then we really didn't ask, they came to us. So now that's might be a once in a lifetime situation, but I think we've had that experience with other donors too, so I think building up that stewardship and relationship before you make the ask is so important to whatever you ask for. And then it's, of course, the research and talking to your peer organizations. We would, about what people have interest in. I don't know if that
Absolutely.
answers it.
No, it does. It does. I mean, I think also kind of Deb touched on this with the governance piece. When you're prospecting and soliciting and doing your research as to what board members might be an appropriate fit for your org and having them do site visits and building that um, authentic appreciation and love for your work and your mission. When you do actually ask a board member to join, typically, at least we do, we have kind of a formal set of roles and expectations that we walk through with each prospect. So they're very clear as to our terms, right? And what is the limit of our terms? And we have unlimited term, 3-year terms. And so a lot of this is in writing, but I'd love to hear from anyone else, Yolanda, Deb, do you have a sense, and because this question has come up quite a bit, what's an appropriate amount? Should it be individualized per board member, or should it be the same across your board? Follow-up question to that is, a lot of organizations have a line item on their budget that says board contributions. Do you have a sense of what percentage that line item should be relative to your overall budget?
Some of the common wisdom is 20 to 25% of annual giving should come from a board and 50% of a campaign. It shifts by what the makeup of the board, the maturity of the organization, and Yolanda may have other data that she uses. I think that standard give and gets are good for raising the bar, right? For having people say, it is a $10,000 give and get, and I believe in give and get, not give or get. And there's a certain amount that's the expectation of giving. The challenge about it is that it usually leaves money on the table. So I've also seen organizations successfully use an average. Each board member here gives an average of X, and people say, oh, that's interesting. But it's because you have people giving 2 and 3 times that, sometimes 10 times that, and sometimes less than that, to create a more inclusive board. So I like that model a little bit better, but I really believe in the individual conversations and individual goal setting with board members.
Yep. Yolanda, I don't know if you want to, yep, go ahead.
Yeah, sure. I totally agree with Deb on the individual conversation piece. Again, depending on how you're working to build out your board and the composition of your board, not everyone is going to have the same kind of financial capacity. And so to Josh's point, know them before you ask. And at the same time, we also, really believe that what you need needs to be upfront. So you need to know what your needs are. If your greatest need is financial capacity and fundraising, then that conversation needs to be had with a prospective board member before you bring them on. Don't set them up because you're so excited because they're so nice and you love them and they love the mission, but don't set them up on fundraising and bring them onto the board and then surprise them with hey, pretty much 90% of the work that we do together is fundraising, right? That, you don't want to damage that relationship. Engage them differently. There are a lot of ways to engage people. If that is kind of your number one need and goal, I think you have to be clear on that. And then, fundraising is something everyone can engage in, no matter what level of capacity they have. And so really thinking through those options for engaging on fundraising and contributing with your team and your board, and being explicit about those out front, I think sets everybody up for success. We also believe in give and get. We want 100% giving on boards, period. If that's $1 or $100,000, we just think when you're, philosophically, if you're joining a fiduciary board, you need to engage in some way on the fiduciary and financial side. That's not to say, we've seen some really great models of folks who actually have gotten fellowships to be on a board. And so someone paid their give for them to be on because their perspective is so important on the board. And so and then they're great at fundraising because they're passionate about the mission in a different way. So again, I think we get caught up in hard and fast rules, the top 10 things a board should do, the top 10 things, and don't we all wish the work was that simple? But you got to get creative and think about it more in a more nuanced way to have the best of the best board. I really think that.
Absolutely. And I think we've actually, some of the questions I had, we've hit upon a lot of this, which was, Yolanda, I was going to come to you about building brand ambassadors, but I think Josh touched on this a little bit in the beginning when he said he had evangelists, on around his board. It's about getting them bought in authentically to your mission. It's site visits, it's conversations, it's to your point, Josh, authentic connections outside of the ask. It's really building that relationship. And as we all know, development is based on relationships. It's not transactional. And so I think these are all great points. I guess we touched on this a little bit, but any other recommendations for tapping into the networks of board members? I think it does stem again from building their rapport and relationship with someone to be able to ask, but other tricks of the trade for getting into the networks that one might have as a board member.
I think you have to go beyond the networks we know, right? You have to get out of your zone. I mean, the danger of most of our boards is that they're too insular. They're, friend to friend nominations instead of a really deliberate, structured process about being engaged in community, about finding people who are proximate to the people with the lived experiences we serve, and being engaged, not just going out and finding the one person that everybody wants, but we really actually need to say, in the next couple of years, let's be very engaged in this community, these organizations, in order to build authentic bridges around that, and be out there. The other thing that I think I just remind everybody is be very careful about talking about fit. Who fits on your board? That is simply code for most Black and brown and other individuals of diverse lived experiences. That's just code for you don't fit in most cases. And so, think about how you use that, and our cultures need to shift. I just am part of a board that has become 50% diverse in over the course of 2.5 years, and it was a really deliberate process. But we're not the same board anymore. And if we'd used our old, frankly, white dominant culture ways, and this is really heavy duty in New England in particular, our conversations are much more direct. Everything is said out loud. We don't step back and say, oh no, we shouldn't say that. We don't say that. Stop it. And I think we have to shed that and understand it is going to change dramatically and get energized by that. And some people won't feel comfortable and they'll need to go.
I love that. I love that, Deb. So we've had actually a couple questions come in on the Q&A around advisory councils and advisory boards. So when you think about, and Josh, maybe this framework is appropriate for you, given kind of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Boston, but having, your community-based boards as well. How do you manage that? When's the right time to actually form advisory boards versus a group of trustees? Josh, Deb, I mean, all of you could answer this, but let's start with Josh.
So, so at the clubs, we the 5 larger clubs, Youth Connect, and then our Mattapan Teen Center all have local advisory boards, and it's really and the executive director from each of those units works exclusively with the board. And then when I was in my role as CEO, I'd try to get to one of those a year, or at least I'd reach out and do some calls to thank yous to folks that were on them. And it's really just a small microcosm of what Deb, Yolanda, and myself have been talking about today. They're just local folks from those communities, be they alums of the club, parents, local politicians, business owners in those communities, et cetera. And they're bought in, they're part of the community, and they fundraise, they show up to events, they do other stuff for the clubs. And then the unique thing, and Bekah, you mentioned, so at the Boys and Girls Clubs, there's the fiduciary board of directors, and we also have a board of trustees of about 140. And there's a lot of cross-pollination between the local advisory boards and the trustees. And then in some cases, some of these trustees move up to the fiduciary board that drives us, which I think there is 64 folks on that. So a lot of committee, most of the work is done in committees. And I would say just one last thing, and it's related to the local advisory boards and related to what Deb was just talking about. sometimes when we all focus, oh, we've got to get so and so, we got to get so and so, we need, whether it's just, for diversifying your board, and no matter what that diversity looks like, or getting people that could make larger gifts, or really just finding ambassadors. Sometimes don't overthink and don't forget about your own backyard. And one of the things we realized is, in terms of ambassadors, we have alums of the club and parents of the clubs that will go speak to folks, in corporate settings or whatever, that could carry and speak directly about the impact of the mission. So, of course, you look out, but then sometimes look in and see, hey, we have an ex-staff member, well, we have someone like that. So,
Or take the up and comer, right? I mean, I know
right.
lots of boards who say, don't take the CEO, don't even take the senior EVP who's going to be the CEO, take the ones who are climbing the ladder and for whom the civic engagement is such a win-win. It's great for their career, it's great for you, and you get some powerful expertise and different networks in those.
Yeah, exactly, Deb. The person that makes things happen for that company.
That's right.
Yeah, exactly. That's how we would say it. So.
And I encourage all of you, Josh, Deb, and Yolanda, to check out. There's some direct questions for you, actually, Yolanda, on there. But one other question that came in that I found interesting with this idea of give and get: is it appropriate if you know one of your board members has really no financial capacity, but has so much to offer otherwise? Is it appropriate in that matter? And then how do you approach that? Now, Yolanda, you actually touched upon this a little bit, and I don't want to steal your answer, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the amount, right? It's about their engagement and their support of the mission. And so if $1 is what it is, that matters, right? And so I'll turn it to you.
Yeah, no, definitely. So look, our work is like focused on racial and gender equity. So this is like something we think about front and center. And at the same time, we're scaling nationally. So the demand for, philanthropic contributions is immense. And so we have to bridge that. In our, you talked, Bekah, about your like job description or board profile, like that you have, the work really documented. We do too. And the line in it is essentially that you need to give, we need to be in your top 3 giving priorities, and you need to give meaningfully, whatever that means to you.
Yep.
And so look, it's not, there are lots of boards that will say like your way in is 25,000 or above. We don't do that. That might be right, actually, for some organizations, depending on their structure and their needs relative to board membership and their mission. We don't do that for that reason. So I think there are options, but that means then we have to track, where are we with board giving? How do we balance it? We got to look at the culture in the boardroom. You can't have the people who give the most money being the ones who make all the decisions, right? So it takes real intention around culture. And I'll say this, just like offer it as maybe a different idea. We've thought a lot about, if we're going to talk about like white dominant culture and white supremacy and how that shows up in the boardroom. We've thought a lot about how we need to build our board to more meaningfully embody our values. And so that does mean like get creative on structure. That means, we don't have like a permanent playbook. We've got a calendar of board meetings, but sometimes we add a committee, sometimes we eliminate it. Sometimes we create a working group that ends. When we go to new cities, we have launch committees. They know when the program's launched, it's done. They're not like forever, going to be held to some set of work. But then we're also creative around how we use our meetings, because we want different people to engage differently, depending on their expertise or their interests, if it's fundraising or it's program or it's policy, whatever it is. So I think, again, think about like, if you had the best possible meeting, what would the components of that be? Ask your board members. They'll all have a different idea. and then try to shape it so that you embody that in different meetings. You won't fill everybody's cup all the time, but you can help them engage with their passion and expertise by actually like creating the space for that passion and expertise.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you touched on something that made me think of a question that one of our attendees had asked, which is, are any of you or have you seen boards, particularly coming out of the past 18 months where we've had this real awakening around social justice, racial justice? Have you seen any boards require the attendance of cultural competency trainings and implicit bias white supremacy trainings happening at boards? Have you seen that? And what's your recommendation around that?
So I've definitely seen it. I don't know about others. I have mixed opinions about that, because like training without plans for action and implementation, to me, actually opened a can of worms that then you don't respond to, that then deepens these issues within an organization. And so I think sometimes, especially at the board level where everybody's got really good intentions and they're like, well, the first thing we need to do is get some training or have a conversation. And actually, no, don't have a conversation if you're not ready to act on the conversation. You have to think about the spectrum of it, because when you open the conversation, and it's not well facilitated, I think it can cause more damage. And that being said, I was just on a panel yesterday on racial equity with the Center for Effective Philanthropy, and we were talking about race and power. And one of the things that we were talking about is how you can, I had kind of offered a philosophy we have is like, it's really hard to change people's beliefs. So like implicit bias training or cultural accountability, responsiveness training is a part, but if your anti-racist practice is we're going to get trained, it's not going to get you anywhere. If you could imagine, like, we're born with these beliefs. It takes a long time to change beliefs. And so honestly, what I said is like, I'm just not willing to put more Black and brown people's lives on the line while I wait for other people's beliefs to come along. But context shapes beliefs. That's why we have them, right? We grow up in a context. So what if you actually work with your teams and your boards to think about, if we were to embody anti-racist practices and move the needle on practice and policy, what would some of those things be that we could do now? Maybe not everybody believes in it, but the context will change and you'll embody it. And then beliefs come along. So I think, not to say you don't also do training. My point really, to plainly state it, is great. Do some training, bring it to your board. Don't do it without a plan for engaging in some action. Yep. The staff are watching you, especially if you're a majority white board. They're watching you have the discussion and not act. So don't do it.
Yeah, that's excellent points. I have two other really interesting questions that came in that I'd love to ask Josh and I'd love to ask Deb. How much time would you recommend a leader actually spend managing a board? And I'm sure you've heard horror stories where the full-time job of the ED is to manage up to the board, but realistically, what do you recommend? Like, how much time should a leader be spending doing this work?
The old adage used to be a third, manage down, manage across, manage up. And I think, this is actually the point of everything we're talking about. The more you get your board functioning well, the more you get peers managing peers too, and you're in sync with your board leadership, the more that the board should be able to shoulder some of that, that it won't be the executive director can be spending more time, or the president or CEO can be spending more time externally and with donors and with communities and with proximate community. But you have to put these pieces in place, and that's the journey. So again, Yolanda and I keep talking about where your organization is in its maturity and development and scale and scope. I'm sure Josh spent a lot of time all the way along managing that board, but it at certain moments it achieved more hum, right? I'll bet you. And things began to work where, as leader, didn't have to spend every minute managing up. And we want to get to that point. I saw some questions that came in before this session from folks who said, kind of, do I have to deal with my board at all? And that's where I would really encourage you to reinvent your relationship to your board and understand that spending and investing some time here makes an enormous difference. And it's sometimes not just at the board meeting, it's that individual time, getting to know each other, getting to know what the true challenges are. That allows your board to be able to be helpful where they should and stay out of the areas where you don't need them.
Exactly. Exactly. And to your point earlier, the executive session really will allow your board members to start talking. And I think that's a really critically underused aspect of the boards is to really just allow the time for board members to talk, right?
Bekah,
so much of board meetings.
Somebody asked in the Q&A about that, should, the CEO or the ED's not sitting in on that. In most cases, I know you have full board, you have an executive session with your ED or CEO for part of it, and then you go to, full executive session. But I believe in they're all different.
Yes, thank you for addressing that question. Josh, this question came in, and I'd love you to take it. It's a little sensitive, but it's the question about when you have a board member that it's just time to say goodbye, it's just time to go. How do you approach in that conversation? It might not be their term limit ending, but it might be prior to that. Yeah. So how do you start that conversation?
So, at Boys and Girls Club, we had, after our executive committee, the committee that really, I would say, ran or drove the organization was our governance committee. It met more than any other committee 6+ times a year. 6 times a year in person, maybe with a phone call. And that's where the work was done. So if Joe Jones, if people feel like, he's been great, but we haven't seen, then it would come down to somebody would probably volunteer on the committee to have a conversation with the person. And I'm not going to say every time, but I'm going to go with 70% of the time. As soon as that conversation starts, the person says, you know what, I haven't been engaged. I'm doing X, Y, Z. And most of the time they'll voluntarily step down. Or sometimes they'll get re-engaged. So it usually comes from peer to peer. I always offer to CEO, look, I said, I'm happy to do it with someone or alone, but usually, when you have a board that's bought in, they take pride in what they do. So they would say, we haven't seen Joe Jones. So that's usually done through the governance committee and through your really intense ambassadors that they're just true believers in the mission. They might not be your biggest donors, but they love, and they've been diehard board members for X amount of years. So that's usually the way to do it.
It's good advice. Looking at the time, we probably have a chance to get to 2 more questions or so. And Deb, I'd love you to tackle this one because I think you touched upon it earlier. It's a question around board retreats and how effective they can and should be. Should they be a staple in board trainings, onboarding, whatnot? So I'd love to hear your thoughts about board retreats.
I am a believer in board retreats. I don't know that they need to happen once a year unless the agendas are really clear. I don't know that you need to have them just to have them unless you are not able to have generative discussion in your board meetings. I'd rather see you build time into your board meetings, a substantive part of the meeting where you are really engaged and letting people ask the questions and share the thoughts that are on their mind around a topic that really needs to be dug into in a more thoughtful way. That said, of course, there's time for board retreats. Frankly, they're often more about bonding or moments that you're teeing up a campaign or a large initiative, or the board is about to go through a leadership transition in the organization. Great time for a retreat. Onboarding is a different thing, and we didn't go deeply into that, but I do believe that a strong onboarding program can make all the difference. And I watch boards think, well, we'll just give them their first year's sort of activity and they'll learn it on the job. And it isn't that that way. I think shaping and helping people understand how this board works, how you do your committee work, particularly, showing up for meetings, showing up for committee meetings. I've seen too many individuals who are less familiar with board service get to the end of the year and they're being beaten up by committee chairs or by board leaders because they didn't show up. We could say that they know the culture, they don't know the culture. And so, but I also believe that a good onboarding has real case study work and gives you a chance to engage with the executive leader or the committee chairs, what's on their minds, what's causing them to lose sleep at night, and what are the big priorities for the next few years. So I'd rather see it spread over the first 6 months of somebody's time on the board, because you're drinking from the fire hose.
Yep, absolutely. And you're right, onboarding programs can make all the difference. And I know we didn't get deep into that today, but great point to make. Yolanda, another question that came in was around the pandemic and eliminating opportunities for in-person donor cultivation and stewardship. Any suggestions how to maintain that level of authentic stewardship through this Zoom remote life?
Yeah, well, the great news is no one has to commute anywhere, right? And so and everyone's gotten really comfortable for the most part with virtual meetings like this or phone calls. And so they're not going to hold it against you. Like, we haven't built a good relationship, so I can't engage, because this is our only form of engagement. I've seen people do some really amazing events online, either like a mix of like pre-recorded content and inspiring videos with also like a live conversation, or like this, having an educational conversation where there's dialogue and engagement, and then people might follow up with you, and you can do that on Zoom or by phone. But I think generally speaking, I would just say, the platform is less important than the connection, and so just stay in touch by email, send some updates, like have a phone call, stay in touch, even though it feels like we can't be in touch, and create a new form for that. I think people are pretty open to it now, and I've seen it be really successful. And in a lot of ways, it's also meaning that people are starting to streamline what they say or put out or whatever, because time's more limited online. And so it's helping us like get right straight to it, get right to the work. And I think we could leverage that in this moment. We're certainly leveraging that as we think about scaling nationally, and I never get on a plane, right? But I'm having so many amazing conversations with amazing people around the country, like fast and furiously and all over the country and at any given day. So there's some parts to embrace about the moment, a lot not to embrace about the moment, but some parts I think we can carry forward too.
Absolutely. Well, in the interest of time, I did want to make sure I allowed the space for any of our panelists to have any closing thoughts. This was a huge kind of broad conversation, but there's so much learning that we just did in the last 55 minutes. But any final thoughts that you'd like to close with?
I'll just start and say, I saw one of the questions asked about transparency with your board and with your board and you. I will just say that personally, and I could be wrong, whether it's your board or the folks you work with every day, I think transparency is so, so important, because if you're always transparent, even with bad news, which might get a little rough, you never have to come clean with anything where it's always going to be rough. And whether it's your board or the folks you work with every day, I think obviously there's some things you can't share. We know that, but being transparent about direction, what you're thinking, how you is always, you don't have to get into the weeds, but just give a big picture. I think it saves folks a lot of issues down the road. And that it pertains to your board as well.
Yeah. I totally agree with that, Josh. I wrote down earlier in the conversation, we use this book in our classes called Emergent Strategies. It's by Adrienne Murray Brown. And she talks about moving at the speed of trust. And especially as you think about building a board that's dynamic and more equitable, I urge people to think about what structures may get in the way of trust. And in fact, my board chair and I talk all the time about the executive session. And I'm always in the executive session, except when there's the conversation about my performance review, because everybody wants to contribute. But what I'll say is I get the review verbatim, word for word, not with names associated, from my board chair. And we have like an implicit or an explicit agreement that like we share what we need to share so that we can move fast, so that we can grow, so that our relationships don't get hurt, so that we trust each other. Even if it's bad news, I'm going to tell you because I never want to hear it from somebody else. So I just urge people to think about how structure, either it enhances or actually dismantles trust, because that's foundational.
Yep, absolutely.
Speed of trust is such an enormously important concept, and I agree with that. I guess I would also just say I would urge everybody listening today to fall a little bit in love with your board and embrace that and create joy. I know that's been sort of that topic or that phrase has been kind of co-opted, but the truth is that partnership, that trust, that engagement with each other. You have a group of enormously talented people. So best not to try to actually keep them at arm's length in a stiff arm, because it doesn't work. And instead think and be honest, be transparent with them about how do you need them and how do you need them to engage and build the individual leadership relationships and the broader board relationships.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys for those and women. For those closing thoughts. Like I said, this has been an incredible hour, an incredible session. This is one of our most highly participated conversations. And we know why. There is so much that I think even I learned, and I'm sure that you took away as meaningful moments and thoughts. So appreciate all of you. I do have 2 other things to do, which is the facial draw. Josh, get ready. Let's see. My team just... My team just emailed me the winners, and Sasha, I'm sorry for the last name, Sasha Papura, Judy Alperin King, Jean Bershman, and Saskia Epstein. All are winners of a facial to Dream Spa Medical. The team will be following up with you. Sorry, Josh. Team will be following up with you to get you that certificate. Thank you for participating today. I also had one other shout out to make, which is to Bumble. Bumble came on as a first-time sponsor of this initiative of WIN, Women in Nonprofit. We are so grateful for their support. I don't know if everyone knows, but Bumble was founded by 2 women. And so we're excited to hopefully deepen that partnership with them across WIN and other initiatives that the Women's Foundation of Boston are pursuing, as well as the Red Sox Foundation. So thank you, Bumble. Last thing I'll say to all of our participants, thank you. We know this is an incredibly busy, chaotic, just unmanageable time in so many ways. We appreciate this hour of your time to listen and to learn and connect. Again, last thank you to our panelists. I appreciate your time as well. And the last thing that will happen as everyone exits is you'll be asked to complete that 4-question survey. I promise it's less than a minute, and it helps inform what we will bring to you next session, which we believe will be this spring. So please take a moment to do that survey. Enjoy the rest of your week. Happy weekend. And let's make this year the best year we can coming off of 2020. Thank you all.